Assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh, and welcome to part 2 of Finding Me in the ITV networks with Dr. Derek Hooks. For those of you who watched the first segment, the first part actually, I'm sure you must have been really interested in what Dr. Derek Hooks had spoken about, but more specifically about the daily encounters of racism, which perhaps many of us take for granted and think, okay, no, this is normal. But racism is something that's not normal, right, Dr. Hooks? Dr. Hooks, what do you think about the way in which we perpetuate this? And of course, you write in one of your discussions, you write about the whole fantasy concept and how this filters in. So explain to me a little bit about that.
Okay, so there's a couple of ways we can do that. But let's just say, without getting bogged down in all the psychology and psychoanalysis of fantasy, is that in some of those theories, a fantasy is what emerges when there's something that one doesn't quite understand. So I suppose in quite psychoanalytic terms, if I can't figure out what you're thinking or what seems to be important for you, I come up with some kind of answer.
Okay.
And in the history of patriarchy, in the history of modernity, I suppose, you see those questions coming up in quite, racism and xenophobic terms. So, Freud's got the big question, what does the woman want? And you could then say, well, what troubles you so much about woman?
Exactly.
Right? I mean, maybe it's in part a patriarchal question. So that's one way of thinking about it. It's just that it's that swerve of irrationality when I'm not quite sure of what I think someone else thinks. And, of course, or what someone else is up to. And, of course, in that respect, fantasy starts to sound very political because it's typically been when when other people have become an other of sorts.
Yes.
So in the colonial context, typically race. But, of course, it's not just about race. All of the stuff we're talking about, it's also about class.
Yes.
It's about different structures or about different categorizations of people. But the odd thing then is the more a group of people are considered to be other or culturally different to me, the more they become unknowable or like strange or exotic.
Okay.
And hence you have fantasies about
Yeah, but
they want this, they want that.
unknowable because I don't understand them or I don't want to understand them.
I think more because I don't want to. And then you have this odd effect almost of knowledge and prejudice and stereotypes. The more I imagine that they must be different to me because they can't obviously be like me,
Right.
I make them more unknowable myself by not, as it were, wanting to know. And the more they become unknowable to me, which is in a way something I'm doing, not what they're doing.
Exactly.
The more they become unknowable to me, the more I start to have these suspicions. And of course, if you open up those spaces, of whether it's of xenophobia, whether it's of patriarchy, whether it's racism, the answer to those questions is what I would call fantasy. So again, Fanon is helpful here. He says, in the colonial setting, white males particularly, but whites generally, have all sorts of imaginings about what they think that blacks want. And that idea works in a number of different spheres where there's some kind of social division or bigotry or prejudice. Whether it's the xenophobic person saying, and of course, South Africans, we are in some respects often very xenophobic. What do they want? They want to take our language, our jobs, our livelihood.
Yeah.
And this theme just seems to happen again and again in these different kinds of moments. Fanon gives a very specific case of it, and he says that white racist societies, and let's even take the US South at a given time, early in the 20th century, not just stay with South Africa the whole time. There's this sense that the black man is sexually active or will do something sexually disturbing.
Right.
I saw this in a little letter in the Benoni City Times just earlier this morning. A woman was complaining, well, there's a lovely bunny park in Benoni.
Today?
I saw it in this, today.
Okay.
I don't know when she made the complaint. Yeah. She said there's a taxi rank right near the bunny park in Benoni. This is a problem because maybe their children would be molested.
Okay.
Like, what's the connection? So there's some kind of form of, she would presumably is thinking some form of racialized difference.
Yes.
Which immediately translates into a sexual threat. How does that work, right? But that's I suppose, why I'm drawing on fantasy, to say that kind of thing happens. It's almost as if you make a hypothesis, a guess, at the aims and agendas of the other, and those aims and agendas almost always seem to be somehow threatening to me.
Yeah, but this hypothesis in this case then is also serving a particular person a purpose. It's about justifying your actions towards that particular person, isn't it?
Yes. And I mean, it depends on how far you want to follow these ideas. But if you want to be a bit psychoanalytic about it, you could then ask this question. The things that people are worried that this other person will do, those things, whether it's sexual, whether it's taking our money or making all the money and leaving us for none, all of these kinds of things, they tend to say more about the person who has those apparent fears.
Yes.
Right? So Fanon mentions, and he's talking about Sartre, Jean-Paul Sartre, who writes a whole book on anti-Semitism. And he said, isn't it funny in some ways that in capitalist places, the stereotype of the Jew is someone who can make lots of money?
Yes. Is that not anti-Semitic?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's a very persistent stereotype, an anti-Semitic stereotype. But of course, what's also odd about it is that in a capitalist setting, what could be better than being able to make some money? So you could say that in some respects, there's almost a disguised form of envy or a wishfulness for the thing that you're blaming the other person of doing. Okay. Now, again, it depends how far you want to follow that argument. And I suppose you need to think about it in a very located place. Otherwise, it's kind of a loose argument. But it's a provocative question that's worthwhile asking, I think.
Okay, so while we provoking, Biko said that the most potent weapon in the hands of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed. So whilst we're on this whole topic of racism, is racism a moral or ethical question?
Well, I mean, I think it's both. It depends on how one approaches it, because there's multiple different theories and so on and so forth. But I mean, what we were talking about earlier, about how racism is perpetuated and continued through physical gestures, actions, words, codes, all of these kinds of things. In that way, it sounds almost as if racism is a structural phenomenon. Sometimes people talk about kind of institutionalized forms of racism.
And so related to power.
Yeah. And I think it's useful to keep that in mind. Because yes, it is the case that you have individualized forms and individualized passions of racism, but it also exists in structural terrain, in institutionalized forms and seemingly anonymous forms. The moral and ethical dimension, I think, is very pertinent. And for me, maybe one of the things to say about that is the constant question of how one considers and is aware of the racism that one may oneself have. And I'm referring particularly here to the idea of the ethical dimension through which one would critique or interrogate racism. And I think, in a way, it's useful to be aware of that, having grown up or lived in South Africa, that many of us will have an element of that, if not all of us in some ways. Definitely. And of course, obviously it differs from very obvious factors. Perhaps if you're more privileged, if you're white, whatever, you would have more of it. But I suppose the ethical challenge to forms of racism is an awareness of how, in a daily setting, one is potentially aiding and abetting or continuing forms of racism. Not by thinking horrible, terrible thoughts necessarily, or maybe by that as well, but sometimes in quite small ways. So I think that would be the ethical question. How am I implicated in the thing that I see around me all the time? Okay,
now we've got about 2 minutes before the end of the segment, and I'm going to ask you a difficult question. Considering what you've just said, is it your responsibility as a white South African then to reflect on your privilege? And how do you then, nullify this whole notion of privilege and then move forward towards social justice? Can you do it? Is it possible? And like many of my students still say, but why are we being blamed? We're born free, or it was the actions of our parents, etc. How do you answer to those difficult questions? I mean, it's difficult for the individuals who are living it. Yes. So we have to be empathetic on both sides of the divide.
Yes. Okay, so you're right. It is a difficult question, but I suppose maybe the simple answer is, I think a little bit of, as much as one can compel oneself to have some reflexivity on how one's life, and even in the small moments, replicates some of South Africa's racist history. Okay. So I think that's a worthwhile thing to try and do. The more difficult question, though, is how do you take that further? Yes. And we've seen in South Africa these big debates, Samantha Weiss, the philosopher from Grahamstown Roads, saying these things about, whites experience, how can one live in this place? Do they not need to be ethical and penitent? I think it's difficult to prescribe and say all whites must now apologize or be penitent. personally, I think there is that dimension is very important. But if you kind of insist on it,
but
it
after
doesn't
that,
quite
then
work.
what? Then what? After you apologize, then what?
You know what? You know what I think?
Yeah.
I think a very basic response to that is to say, A, it's really difficult to know exactly what. You have to find your own way,
Yes.
right? And you can't prescribe that. And another thing, which doesn't even sound like it's about racism, but again, and it's a reflection on myself, is one of the things you can do is just learn to speak an African language. I mean, I know I sound a little bit silly, maybe even a bit naive in that respect, but it just opens doors in a different kind of way. And it gives you an appreciation. I mean, Fanon's got this thing where he says, you know, if you come from Africa and you go to Europe, people think that Europeans speak multiple languages. They can speak French, German, all of these are languages. But if you're African and you say, well, I speak 3 languages and one of them is English, people think that you can't really speak English, that you don't have language.
Yes,
right?
that's true.
And I suppose what I'm suggesting there with the language thing is it's a kind of opening to an appreciation of African culture as well.
Okay, so while we're focusing on this appreciation of African culture, we're going to now start appreciating Steve Biko. We have to go to a break. When we come back, the last segment, I want to focus on Steve Biko. So we'll see you after the break. Assalamu alaikum and welcome to the final segment of Finding Me in the ITV Networks today with Dr. Derek Hook. Before we went on to the break, we started this whole idea of identifying what it is that you're going to do to overcome your own racism. And Biko said the basic tenet of black consciousness is that the black man must reject all value systems that seek to make him a foreigner in the country of his birth and reduce his basic human dignity. And Dr. Hook, I'm sure that is a major comment by Biko, because I mean, if you're going to reject all the value systems, it's about structurally breaking down almost the entire society and then rebuilding it, which of course has not happened post 1994. That's why many still question the whole idea of are we in a post-apartheid, because many things are still perpetuating. But before I get to that particular question, you have written this book now, Voices of Liberation by Steve Biko. I mean, was it difficult to write the book, and how did you find the material to put together? I mean, it's the first of its kind in South Africa, right?
Yeah. I mean, okay, so the book was a little bit difficult to write. I'd started to be interested in Steve Biko's writings and in black consciousness because I was interested in what to teach in psychology in South Africa, which would have a pertinence beyond a whole series of, you know, white male American psychologists. Guys. So it was important. But to begin with, the first attempt was just to try and understand some of the things that he was saying and to read a lot of his stuff. This book does some of that, but it also has to include some of a biographical section on his life.
Yes.
And that was a bit challenging because I'm more used to writing like a social scientist or as an academic. And I wanted to try and bring some aspects of his life to the forefront and give some sense of the kind of person he was.
Who is Biko?
Yeah.
Yes.
And of course, in doing that, that's a challenge because it's a different kind of writing. So some of the things that I started to do was just, for example, to collect impressions where people had written their impressions of him and try to layer those and try to get some kind of impression of Biko to come through. Also importantly, the book, there's a short biographical section and then there's also a section at the end about his legacy today. But a large part of the book is just about writings on Biko. And I think that was the other thing to get right in the book, not to try and represent Biko, but to try and wherever possible, just quote him directly, let him speak.
Okay, so many of these great leaders often consulted with other great minds. It's obvious that they learned from them, they shared ideas with them. So who do you think had a great influence on Biko, considering all the work that you've done now?
It's amazing to have gone this route from, and I suppose you could say it's something about being trapped in some kind of white liberal thing, to have to go first to Fanon, then to realize, why am I teaching Fanon in class in South Africa when I could be teaching Biko?
Right.
To do that, and then reading Biko and realizing, well, actually, it comes also before someone else, before Biko. And there's a number of people who you could speak about. But one of the crucial people, and I think his time is now, is Robert Sobukwe. because it's amazing to the extent to which in South Africa today there's this amnesia about the role of the Pan-African Congress and Robert Sobukwe. There's a lot of complicated and some quite straightforward reasons why that may be the case. And I see Sobukwe as someone who's an extraordinarily ethical person, and also who had no respect for the concept of race. Obviously, he has a great and highly developed awareness of white supremacy and white racism, but he seemed to be one of those people he would speak the same way to the president of the country or to the guy who was sweeping the floor. And it relates to the earlier question, what does one to do about racism? And one way, and I think Sobukwe is such a strong exemplar of this, is to treat people as human beings.
It's about human dignity.
It's about human dignity. Those phrases sound a bit hollow, but I mean, if you think of so many instances where people treat someone else in a way they wouldn't expect to be treated. I'm sorry to be stuck on the whole white middle class thing, but you give a guy who's looking after your car R4 or R5. I mean, if the situation had to be reversed for a day, you know what I'm saying?
You would never do that.
Someone gives me R5 to look at someone's car, what the hell am I going to do with R5, So those little moments, and it links to what we were saying earlier, those are little moments when there's some breach and you're not really, if you're the guy who's giving the tip, you're not really treating that person
fairly.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you don't even think about it twice.
Yeah, and in fact, sometimes people feel quite good about it.
Yes,
right?
I gave it up, yes. Let's talk a little bit about Robert Sobukwe, because I think many people don't know him. Don't even know about him. Like you said, there's been a consensus to forget Sobukwe.
Yeah.
So who is he and what role did he play in the liberation struggle and why is he important to me as a South African?
Okay, so Robert Mangaliso Sobukwe was a guy who was born in Graaff-Reinet in the Eastern Cape and was an avid reader, came from a poor background, had a big intellect, went to school, started reading, started doing incredibly well, and eventually managed to get the opportunity to go to university. And one of the great ironies is one of the things that he started studying was, what's it called, native administration. And of course, when he realized what native administration meant in the apartheid system, he became increasingly appalled by all of this and started to move into politics. So he was at Fort Hare for a while, does some amazing speeches there, and of course then has a crucial part to play in the ANC Youth League. And is very influenced by figures like Anton Lembede. And of course then the big crucial split comes, and this I think is what sometimes gets forgotten about. I mean, he was a crucial guy, he was a big intellectual contributor, and he started to say, I don't know if everything that the ANC is doing is the best way to respond to this situation that we find ourselves in. And to put it in very straightforward terms, I think he started to say we need a different set of tools for this liberation movement. And one of the points of the break was he was, and Biko learns from this, he was very conscious and aware of the problem of white communists having too much of a say, in his terms, in what the ANC was going to do, even in things like the Freedom Charter. And so he has a vision of African for Africans, which we could speak more about, and he's wary that if there is a proper liberation struggle, it must be led, and the agency of that struggle must be the oppressed, not the oppressor, right? Because otherwise it'll never be a proper transformation.
Yes.
So this is his basic message.
But then he was 100% right, isn't it? Because there hasn't been a proper transformation in South Africa.
Biko makes the same thing, and both of them become demonized by the white press and white liberals as saying, you guys are like reverse racists. You don't want whites to be involved. And that view is misleading, because that's not what they were doing. They were simply saying this: if you want a proper change, if you want this to be led, if there's some transformation, the oppressed have to be the ones who are the agents in making those changes, not the people who are already benefiting from the system. We're just repeating the same point.
Yes.
And that doesn't translate into anti-whiteism.
Yes.
It translates into, let's really make sure that it's the people who are oppressed who have the agency to do this thing. So, and that message, I think, is crucial. So that means that there's a split from him and the ANC. And then, of course, what often then also gets elided is that when you have Sharpeville, this huge cataclysmic incidents, lots of people getting killed by apartheid police, this is the direct, it's because Sobukwe says, let's have an anti-pass campaign.
Okay.
Leave our passes at home, walk off to police stations and offer ourselves to be arrested. Because if we do that in large enough numbers,
they just
won't be able to process it. Yeah. And of course, also what's sometimes forgotten is he writes a very articulate, very clear letter to chief of police at the time saying, this is what's going to happen, don't use force. All of the guys that are going to, I've emphasized this a number of times, they will cooperate with you. They'll cooperate in being arrested. So
he was following the process.
He could imagine what would happen, and he was afraid of that, but he made it very clear. So when it did happen, I suppose he wasn't necessarily surprised, although he was appalled, and he had already warned them not to do that. And of course, that's the big moment, right? Because in a way, things intensified dramatically after that. Yes. But it was also an important strategic thing to do, because one way of trying to think about those times is you've got this massive system of apartheid racism, which operates in so many spheres, virtually all spheres of your life.
Yes.
The way to act for him was the pass. And the ANC was doing a similar thing, but in a way, he preempted some of what they were doing. And then just after that, you have these pictures of key ANC guys.
Okay, so we're nearly at the end, and I've got two very important questions, which I want you to give me as briefly as possible, but as comprehensive. The first question that I want to know, when you spoke about Mandela, you said that Mandela did not constitute a global challenge to white economic and supremacist power. What do you mean by that?
Okay, so I'm quoting someone else. Yes. The guy's named Slavoj Žižek, and he's a big social theorist. And he makes the argument, let's think about things, he says. Mandela is incredibly globally loved and popular, universally regarded.
A role model, yes.
Yeah. If that's the case, did he really constitute a threat to structures of power, and indeed to capitalist forms of power? And his answer is no, he didn't.
No, of course not. Yes.
So that's what that's meant. And of course, in a way, then you could take that argument and say, well, Sobukwe, who's been so denied, forgotten about, elided, neglected.
He was a threat.
Presumably he was more of a threat.
Yeah. And of course, then you see the compromise in terms of the transition in 1994, and the fact that economic power is still in the hands of the same people, so we can understand that. Okay, so now we come to the final part. And Biko said, being black is not a matter of pigmentation. Being black is a reflection of a mental attitude. So what does it mean when Biko speaks about a black consciousness, and then if you can conclude by telling us about what does it mean when you say Africa is for Africans? Who is an African, and do me and you qualify as being African?
For Sobukwe, and of course there's the echo of the idea in Biko, to be an African is someone who's wholeheartedly committed to Africa in multiple different kinds of ways, and who is committed to being led by the African people.
Right.
Now, of course, also in the Biko quote, the point that one would pick up on is that you could be African, or in an odd kind of way, black, seemingly without the pigmentation of being what is typically recognized as black. So, people can get all excited about that, say, I'm black, I'm African. But actually, I think what both of them are saying, you can't just, it's not a willful act. It requires...
It's not just about color.
Yeah. It's not just about color, but it requires a commitment, and a commitment to that as African culture. So you also asked, what's black consciousness? And black consciousness, in many ways, is an attempt to rejuvenate aspects of African culture, African identity, of blackness, not as of some secondary importance, but as of primary importance to any viable identity in an African context. But it's also about a kind of solidarity. It's an awareness of a history of oppression, a history of dehumanization, as we've alluded to already, and a realization that one needs to come together, which I think is also crucial if one is to understand black consciousness. For Biko, black consciousness means if you're Asian, if you're colored, if you've been discriminated against and have some secondary position third position in apartheid structures, that means you've got something in common. And that is a basis of solidarity and coming together. So for both of them, this notion of Pan-Africanism and blackness or black consciousness, it's also about being able to join a whole series of groups of people that have been otherwise split up into ethnic differentiations, Xhosa, Zulu, whatever, And I think that's crucial, because it doesn't just mean, I can move between racial categories, and it doesn't just mean that I can recategorize myself. It means that where some of those categories exist, you have to be aware of the divide and conquer logic of apartheid and try and get some community, some vibrant cohesion within those potential divides.
Okay, so we're at the end of the interview, but I think the final comment is perhaps that what he's saying is that don't impose another identity on us, or don't claim a superior identity. If you want to be African, then genuinely embrace everything that is African, isn't it?
Yeah.
So that's referring back again to the human dignity of the African, which has been so compromised, I think, for centuries through colonial struggles and slavery, etc. So it's a phenomenal point. So very quickly, 30 seconds, your last comment.
My last comment is how impossible is that to do for, say, middle-class white South Africans, to give up privilege? Can you do that? So in the previous segment, it made it sound like white people could easily be African. And now I suppose I just want to follow that up and ask, can they? Because if it means giving up privileges derived precisely from apartheid categories, how many whites would be willing to actually do that?
And with that, I'd like to conclude and ask the viewers too. How many of us are guilty of that too? And how many of us are prepared to give up privileges? The time has come now for us to seriously introspect. Fi amanillah, wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. And thank you, Derek, for being here with me today.
Thanks.